The 17th of August 1923, Bethlehem Steel, Pennsylvania. The forging floor of shop number 7 at 6:47 inches the morning. The air already thick with heat, even before the sun fully rose. 3 men stood beneath a machine that towered 3 stories above them, a hydraulic forging press capable of exerting 300 tons of force. John Kowalski adjusted the steel die one last time, his hands moving with the precision that came from 11 years of experience. Thomas O'Brien watched the pressure gauges, ready to signal the operator. Samuel Washington, the youngest of the crew at 19, steadied the positioning chain. The press descended, slowly at first, as it always did, 12 feet, 14 feet. Then, something changed. Not a sound, but an absence of sound. The hydraulic hum that had been constant suddenly stopped. For a fraction of a second, the massive ram hung, suspended in silence. Then it fell. 18 feet of uncontrolled descent, 300 tons of steel accelerating under nothing but gravity. The impact lasted less than 2 seconds. The sound was not a crash, it was compression. Air forced from lungs, steel meeting flesh. Then silence again, broken only by the spray of hydraulic oil across the concrete floor and the slow drip of fluid from ruptured lines 20 feet above. 3 men went to work that morning. None of them came home. But this story is not just about one morning or one machine. It is about an entire era when industrial progress measured its cost in lives, when the machines that built modern America were fed by the men who operated them, and when the physics of catastrophic failure was understood too late by everyone except the workers who died learning it. If stories like this move you, if you believe these men and their sacrifices deserve to be remembered, I would be grateful if you could subscribe to this channel. Let me know in the comments which industrial disasters I should investigate next. Your support helps preserve the history of those who built our world. Now, let's go back to the beginning, back to when someone first asked, what if we could shape steel not with hammers and heat, but with pure, sustained hydraulic force? What if we could build a machine powerful enough to forge armor plates, ship propellers, and gun barrels in a single compression? What if we could concentrate that much energy in one place, above one floor, where men worked every single day? The answer to those questions stood 3 stories tall in shop number 7, and by the summer of 1923, it had already killed before. To understand why the 300-ton press existed at all, you have to go back to the 1850s, when American industry was still figuring out how to work with steel at scale. Before hydraulic presses, forging meant hammers, steam hammers, drop hammers, massive weights lifted by chains or compressed air and dropped onto glowing steel. These hammers worked, but they had limits. They were loud enough to shatter windows a quarter mile away. They shook buildings so violently that nearby structures cracked. Most importantly, they delivered force in sudden impacts, which made precision difficult and created internal stresses in the metal that could lead to catastrophic failures later. The hydraulic press offered something fundamentally different. Instead of striking steel, it squeezed it, slowly, controllably, with force that could be sustained for minutes instead of delivered in milliseconds. The principle behind hydraulic power was elegantly simple, discovered by Joseph Bramah in 1795, but not scaled to industrial size until the late 1800s. Pascal's law states that pressure applied to a confined fluid is transmitted equally in all directions. Push on a small piston with 1 pound of force, and you can lift a large piston with 100 pounds of force, as long as the area difference is proportional. In practical terms, this meant that a relatively small pump could generate pressures of 4,000 or 5,000 pounds per square inch in hydraulic lines. Those lines fed into massive cylinders containing rams the size of tree trunks. When that pressurized fluid pushed against the ram, the force multiplied by the ram's surface area. A cylinder with a ram 30 inches in diameter, operating at 4,500 pounds per square inches, generated over 3 million pounds of force, 300 tons, enough to flatten a car into a sheet of metal an inch thick, enough to forge steel components that no hammer could touch. By 1900, Bethlehem Steel was America's second largest steel producer, racing to match Carnegie's output while carving out specialties Carnegie couldn't dominate. Bethlehem focused on large-scale forgings, armor plating for battleships, propeller shafts for ocean liners, gun barrels for the Navy, railroad components built to survive decades of punishment. Charles Schwab, who ran Bethlehem after leaving Carnegie, understood that size mattered, not just the size of the company, but the size of what it could produce. Bigger components meant bigger contracts. Bigger contracts meant dominance. So the presses grew. In 1905, Bethlehem installed a 150-ton hydraulic press. By 1912, a 200-ton model. In 1918, as World War I drove demand for armor and artillery to unprecedented levels, the company commissioned Watson-Stillman Company to build something no American facility had ever operated. A 300-ton hydraulic forging press with an 18-foot vertical stroke and the capability to shape steel components weighing up to 50 tons. The specifications were staggering. The press frame was built from cast steel sections, each weighing over 20 tons, bolted together to create a structure 40 feet tall. The hydraulic ram itself was a solid steel cylinder, 32 inches in diameter and 22 feet long, weighing 18 tons empty. 4 high-pressure hydraulic lines, each 3 inches in diameter, fed pressurized fluid to the cylinder from an accumulator tank that stored hydraulic energy like a massive battery. The accumulator was a vertical tank 12 feet tall and 6 feet in diameter, filled with hydraulic oil and pressurized to 4,500 pounds per square inches by pumps running constantly in the basement below. When the press operated, the process was both brutal and hypnotic. A steel component, heated to 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit in furnaces located 50 feet away, was carried to the press on custom rail carts. Workers used long tongs to position the glowing steel on the lower die, a massive block of tool steel machined to exact specifications. The upper die, suspended from the ram, was lowered by opening control valves that allowed pressurized hydraulic fluid to push the ram downward. As the dies met the steel, pressure built. The steel resisted. The press did not care. 300 tons of force spread across the die face, and the steel surrendered, flowing like clay into whatever shape the dies demanded. This was the promise of hydraulic forging: controlled violence, precision at scale, and the ability to produce components no other method could create. Bethlehem Steel's marketing materials, called the 300-ton press, the most advanced forging system in the Western Hemisphere. Engineering journals published detailed analyses of its design, praising the efficiency and capability it represented. What those journals did not discuss, what the marketing materials did not mention, and what the engineers in their offices perhaps did not fully grasp, was what happened when that much stored energy found a weakness. Because by 1923, the press was no longer new. It had operated nearly continuously for 5 years, running 20 hours a day, 6 days a week. Every cycle stressed every component. Every compression sent shock waves through the frame. Every heating and cooling cycle expanded and contracted the metal, creating microscopic changes that accumulated like interest on a debt that would eventually come due. The men who worked beneath it every day felt something the engineers did not. They felt the vibrations through the floor. They heard the subtle changes in the hydraulic hum. They saw the slow seep of oil from fittings that had been tight 2 years earlier. They knew the machine was aging, but knowing and being heard are different things. And in 1923, at Bethlehem Steel, workers who raised concerns about equipment safety faced a choice: keep working or find work elsewhere. In an economy where men lined up at the gates every morning hoping for a day's labor, that was not really a choice at all. So the press kept running. and the men kept working beneath it, until the morning when knowing was no longer enough. To understand what happened on the 17th of August, 1923, you need to understand something about hydraulic systems that was not widely taught in engineering schools at the time. They do not simply contain pressure, they store energy. And stored energy, unlike moving machinery, does not announce itself. It sits silent and invisible, waiting. The hydraulic system that powered the 300-ton press was built around a principle called pressure accumulation. Rather than pumping hydraulic fluid directly to the press cylinder every time the ram needed to move, the system used pumps that ran continuously, filling an accumulator tank with pressurized fluid. Think of this accumulator as a battery, but instead of storing electrical energy, it stored mechanical energy in the form of compressed hydraulic oil. The tank operated at 4,500 pounds per square inch, maintained by a combination of mechanical pumps and compressed nitrogen gas that pushed against the oil from above. This design had advantages. The press could move quickly because it was not waiting for pumps to build pressure. It could deliver sustained force because the accumulator held enough volume to push the ram through its entire 18-foot stroke without pressure dropping significantly. But it also meant that at any given moment, even when the press was not operating, the system contained enormous stored energy. A fully charged accumulator at 4,500 pounds per square inches, with a volume of approximately 400 gallons, stored roughly the same energy as 70 pounds of TNT. That energy was contained by pipes, fittings, valves, and seals. In 1918, when the press was new, those components were built to handle the pressure with safety margins built in. High-pressure hydraulic lines were made from seamless steel tubing with wall thicknesses of nearly half an inch. Fittings were forged steel, threaded and torqued to specifications. Seals were leather or early synthetic rubber compounds replaced regularly during scheduled maintenance. But by 1923, those margins had eroded. Not visibly, not obviously, but definitively. Metal fatigue was still a poorly understood phenomenon in the 1920s. Engineers knew that repeated stress could weaken metal over time, but the mechanisms were not well characterized. What happened at the microscopic level was this. Every pressure cycle, every heating and cooling cycle, created tiny stresses at the grain boundaries within the steel. These stresses propagated microscopic cracks, too small to see but growing with each cycle. In areas of high stress concentration, such as threaded fittings or welded joints, these cracks grew faster. The hydraulic lines feeding the 300-ton press experienced extreme cyclic loading. When the press operated, pressure in the supply lines surged from 4,500 pounds per square inches to nearly 5,000 pounds per square inches as fluid rushed toward the cylinder. When the ram retracted, pressure dropped but never reached zero because the accumulator maintained baseline pressure. This cycle repeated dozens of times per shift, thousands of times per month, tens of thousands of times per year. Each cycle grew the cracks a little more. By August of 1923, one particular section of the main supply line, located approximately 20 feet above the press floor, contained a crack that had propagated through 60% of the pipe wall thickness. It was invisible from the outside because it originated on the inside surface, hidden from inspection. The crack followed a helical path along a region where the pipe had been slightly over-torqued during installation 5 years earlier, creating residual stress that accelerated fatigue. On the morning of August 17, as John Kowalski made his final adjustment to the die positioning, the press operator opened the control valve to begin lowering the ram. Hydraulic fluid at 4,500 pounds per square inches surged through the supply line. The surge created a brief pressure spike, a phenomenon called water hammer that occurs when fluid in motion suddenly encounters resistance. For perhaps the 10,000th time, the pipe wall flexed under the spike. This time, the crack reached critical length. In a fraction of a second, it propagated through the remaining wall thickness. The pipe ruptured, 4,500 pounds per square inch of hydraulic pressure, suddenly exposed to atmosphere, did what physics demanded. The fluid exploded outward as a cutting jet capable of slicing through wood and flesh. But the greater danger was not the spray. It was what happened to the press. Hydraulic systems work on incompressibility. The fluid cannot be squeezed, so pressure applied at one end transmits instantly to the other end. This is what allows a small pump to move a massive ram. But it also means that hydraulic systems have no inherent safety against sudden pressure loss. When the supply line ruptured, pressure supporting the 18-ton ram disappeared in less than a second. The ram, which had been descending slowly under controlled pressure, suddenly fell under gravity alone, 18 feet of freefall. The physics are straightforward but brutal. The ram accelerated at 32 feet per second squared. By the time it hit the lower die, it was traveling at approximately 34 feet per second, or 23 miles per hour. That might not sound fast, but speed is only part of the equation. Kinetic energy is 1/2 mass times velocity squared. An 18-ton ram moving at 34 feet per second carried roughly 2.8 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy. When it struck the lower die, that energy had to go somewhere. It went into whatever was between the ram and the die. Steel components being forged could absorb some of the energy through deformation. But the three men positioned near the die to make final adjustments could not. A human body is not designed to resist compressive forces. Our internal organs operate at pressures measured in single-digit psi. Our bones can withstand perhaps a few thousand pounds of force before fracturing. The impact of the free-falling ram generated localized pressures exceeding 50,000 pounds per square inches across whatever it struck. The three men had no chance. Human reaction time averages 1/4 of a second to register a stimulus, another 1/10 of a second to initiate a response, and perhaps another 2/10 of a second to begin moving. Total, slightly over 1/2 a second. The ram completed its fall in 1.2 seconds, and the first indication that something was wrong was the absence of the hydraulic hum. By the time John Kowalski's brain registered that silence and began to process what it meant, the ram was already past the point where even perfect reaction could have saved him. The sound described by witnesses was not what you might expect. There was no crash of metal on metal because the ram was designed to contact the die. What they heard instead was the sharp report of the hydraulic line rupturing, like a gunshot in the confined space, followed by a heavy compression sound as the ram hit, and then the rain of hydraulic oil spraying from the broken line 20 feet overhead. Several witnesses said the most disturbing part was what came after: silence. The press stopped humming. The pumps in the basement cut off automatically when sensors detected the pressure loss. For the first time in recent memory, shop number 7 was quiet. Then someone started screaming. The safety systems designed into the press were typical for the era, which is to say, inadequate by any modern standard. There was an emergency stop button that could cut power to the hydraulic pumps, but it was useful only during normal operations. Once the ram was in free fall, no button could restore the hydraulic pressure that had been supporting it. There were mechanical locks that could be engaged to hold the ram in the raised position during maintenance, but they took several minutes to set and were not used during normal operations because they slowed production. There was a blast shield protecting the operator's station, but it was designed to protect against flying metal fragments from forging operations, not from catastrophic hydraulic failure. The men working near the die had no protection at all. Their job required them to be in the danger zone. Someone had to position the steel, adjust the dies, and verify alignment before each compression. This was skilled work, requiring judgment and experience that could not be automated with 1920s technology. So the practice was to position the work, signal the operator, and step back before the ram descended more than a few feet. The men had done this hundreds of times. They knew the press intimately, knew its rhythm and its sounds. They knew when to step back. What they could not have known was that on this particular morning, stepping back would take more time than they had. The ram did not give them the usual seconds to clear. it gave them none. When investigators arrived later that morning, the physical evidence told a clear story. The ruptured hydraulic line was immediately visible, still dripping oil onto the floor below. The break was clean, consistent with metal fatigue rather than external damage. The ram had come to rest in its fully descended position, the upper die pressed firmly against the lower die, with 3 human bodies compressed between them. Hydraulic fluid pooled across the floor, mixing with blood and creating a slick that workers would spend hours cleaning. The press frame itself showed no damage. This was somehow the most disturbing detail. The machine that had just killed 3 men was structurally sound, mechanically intact, ready to be repaired and returned to service. The failure was not in the massive cast steel frame, or the precisely machined ram, or the carefully designed cylinder. The failure was in a 3-inch pipe that had been installed 5 years earlier and never inspected for internal damage, because the tools to do so did not exist, and the culture to demand it had not yet developed. The press, as designed, could not fail gently. There was no failure mode that involved slowly losing pressure or gradually degrading performance. When a high-pressure hydraulic line ruptures, the transition from normal operation to catastrophe is measured in fractions of a second. This is the nature of stored energy. It does not leak away gradually, it releases all at once. And on the morning of the 17th of August 1923, it released onto 3 men who were simply doing their jobs. John Kowalski came to America in 1908 from a village outside Krakow, Poland, where his father had worked in salt mines, and his mother had raised 8 children on wages that barely bought bread. He was 16 when he arrived at Ellis Island with $12 and an address written on paper by a cousin who had made the journey 2 years earlier. The address led to a boarding house in South Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where Polish immigrants crowded 3 and 4 to a room, saving money to send home or to bring family members across. John found work as a general laborer at Bethlehem Steel within a week. He carried water, cleaned floors, and watched the skilled workers with the intensity of a man who understood that survival meant learning. By 1912, he had worked his way into the forging shop. By 1918, he was adjusting dies on the new 300-ton press. By 1923, at age 34, he was one of the most experienced press operators in shop number 7, trusted with the delicate work of positioning dies to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. He was married to Anna, also from Poland, and they had 4 children aged 3 to 11. Anna was 5 months pregnant with their 5th child. John earned $5.20 per day, good money for skilled work, enough to rent a small house in the immigrant neighborhood and to save a little each month. He sent money home to Poland twice a year. He attended St. Michael's Catholic Church on Sundays. His oldest son, also named John, was doing well in school and talked about becoming an engineer. On the evening of the 16th of August 1923, John Kowalski came home at 7 p.m. after a 10-hour shift. He ate the dinner Anna had prepared, played with the children briefly, and went to bed at 9 p.m. because his shift started at 6:30 a.m. This was his routine 6 days a week, every week, and had been for years. There was nothing unusual about August 16 or about the morning of August 17. He woke at 5 a.m., dressed in work clothes, still stiff with yesterday's sweat and oil, and walked the mile to the plant because streetcar fare was 5 cents and walking was free. Thomas O'Brien was second-generation Irish-American, born in South Bethlehem in 1895. His father had worked at Bethlehem Steel until a crane accident killed him in 1910. Thomas started working at 14 to support his mother and 3 younger sisters. He began in the blast furnace area, one of the hottest and most dangerous jobs in the plant, and worked his way to the forging shop by demonstrating the combination of strength, precision, and judgment that the work required. By 1923, at 28, he had recently been promoted to lead press operator, a position that came with an extra 40 cents per day and the responsibility of coordinating the crew and interfacing with foremen. Thomas was engaged to Margaret Sullivan, a teacher at the Catholic elementary school. They were to be married on September 8, less than 3 weeks after the accident. Margaret had been planning the wedding for months. The invitations had been sent. Thomas's mother was sewing Margaret's dress. They had saved enough for a small apartment and some furniture. Thomas talked about eventually moving into supervision, maybe becoming a foreman, making enough that Margaret could stop working if they had children. He was careful, conscientious, and respected by the men he worked with. He had also, according to records later discovered during litigation, submitted a written concern to his foreman 2 months before the accident. The concern, dated the 14th of June, 1923, noted unusual vibrations in the press hydraulic system and recommended inspection of the supply lines. It was logged in the maintenance request book with the notation, "Will schedule during next planned downtime," but there was no planned downtime. The press ran 20 hours a day, 6 days a week, because production schedules demanded it. Inspection would require shutting down for at least a full day, possibly longer if problems were found. The decision to defer inspection was not made by anyone who worked on the press. It was made by men in offices who looked at production numbers and decided that the vibrations Thomas O'Brien noted were probably nothing serious. Samuel Washington was 19 years old and had worked at Bethlehem Steel for 11 months. He was unusual in shop number 7, not just because of his age, but because he was one of the few black workers in a shop that was predominantly Polish, Irish, and Italian immigrants. Samuel's father had died in 1921, leaving Samuel as the primary support for his mother and 3 younger siblings. He had started as a general laborer, sweeping floors and moving materials, but he was smart, physically strong, and determined to advance. When an opening came up for a press assistant position, he applied, despite having less experience than other candidates. The foreman who hired him later said he chose Samuel because the kid asked better questions than men who'd been here for years. Samuel was not supposed to be at the press on the morning of August 17. The regular assistant, a man named Viktor Petrov, had sent word he was sick. Samuel volunteered to fill in, partly because he knew it would look good to management, and partly because he needed every cent he could earn. His mother was behind on rent. His youngest sister needed shoes. An extra day's pay of $4.10 meant the difference between keeping the apartment and losing it. So when the foreman asked if anyone could cover for Petrov, Samuel stepped forward. He had assisted at the press before. He knew the work. He did not know that the hydraulic system was slowly failing, or that Thomas O'Brien had raised concerns about it, or that the decision to defer maintenance had been made by people who would never stand beneath the ram. These 3 men were not careless. They were not ignorant. They knew the press was dangerous, because every machine in shop number 7 was dangerous. They had all seen injuries. John Kowalski had watched a man lose 3 fingers to a drop hammer in 1916. Thomas O'Brien had helped carry a man to the infirmary after a forging blank slipped from tongs and crushed his foot. Samuel Washington had seen a crane cable snap and send a 2-ton ingot crashing through the floor. They knew the risks, but they also knew the alternative. No job, no income, no way to support the people who depended on them. This was the calculus of industrial work in 1923. You could be careful, skilled, and vigilant, and still die because someone in an office decided that production schedules mattered more than maintenance schedules. You could notice warning signs, report them, and die anyway because the machinery of industry moved faster than the machinery of safety. You could do everything right and still be in the wrong place when a pipe that had been slowly failing for months finally ruptured. The culture of Bethlehem Steel, in 1923, like most heavy industry of the era, operated on assumptions that would be unthinkable today. Workers were viewed as replaceable. There were always more men at the gates looking for work. Safety equipment was minimal because it slowed production and cost money. Maintenance was deferred until equipment actually broke because downtime meant lost output. The company's implicit position was that accidents were inevitable, part of the cost of doing business. and that the appropriate response was to pay minimal compensation to families and move on. This attitude was not unique to Bethlehem Steel, it was industry standard. Carnegie Steel, Republic Steel, U.S. Steel, all operated under similar assumptions. Between 1915 and 1930, forging press incidents alone killed more than 400 workers in American steel plants. These were not the only deaths. Blast furnace accidents, crane failures, ladle spills, and a dozen other categories of industrial disaster killed thousands more. The deaths were so common that they were rarely front-page news unless the body count was particularly high. Workers developed their own informal safety culture because the official one was inadequate. Old-timers taught newcomers which machines were temperamental, which foremen would listen to concerns, and which warning signs to watch for. There were superstitions. Some men refused to work on certain presses after seeing accidents, believing the machines were hungry. There were unspoken protocols. Workers developed their own spacing and communication systems to minimize exposure to danger zones, even when these protocols reduced efficiency. These informal practices saved lives, but they could not overcome fundamental equipment failures or management decisions to defer maintenance. The men who worked these presses were not ignorant of hydraulics or physics. They understood that the press held enormous force. They could feel it through the floor when it operated, hear it in the hum of the pumps, see it in the way steel deformed under the ram. What they did not understand, because the engineering knowledge did not yet exist in accessible form, was the specific mechanisms by which hydraulic systems fail catastrophically. They did not know about fatigue crack propagation or stress concentration factors or the relationship between cyclic loading and time to failure. They knew the press was dangerous. They did not know it was failing. When the rupture occurred at 6:47 a.m., the men closest to the press had perhaps 3/4 of a second of warning. The change in sound, the absence of the hydraulic hum, maybe a glimpse of oil spraying from above. Then the ram fell, and 3 men who had done nothing wrong, who had followed every procedure, who had simply been doing the job they were skilled at and needed to support their families, were crushed so completely that their bodies could not be separated from each other or from the steel between the dies until the ram was raised hours later. The press was shut down immediately. Workers from other areas of shop number 7 crowded around until foremen ordered them back to their stations. The plant superintendent arrived within 20 minutes. A company doctor arrived shortly after, though there was nothing medical to be done. The families were not notified immediately because company policy was to be certain of identities before sending notifications, and in this case, identification took time. Anna Kowalski learned that her husband was dead when a company representative came to her door at 11:30 a.m. She was hanging laundry. Her oldest son was at school. The representative, an assistant to the plant superintendent, was not unkind, but he was efficient. He confirmed John's death, expressed condolences on behalf of Bethlehem Steel Corporation, and explained that she would need to come to the plant office the next day to discuss compensation and the timeline for vacating company housing. Anna, 5 months pregnant and suddenly a widow with 4 children and no income, asked if there had been pain. The representative said he did not know but thought it had been very quick. This was true. There had been no time for pain. Margaret Sullivan, Thomas O'Brien's fiancée, was teaching her afternoon class when the school principal came to her classroom and quietly asked her to come to the office. She knew immediately that something was wrong. The principal, a nun who had taught at the school for 30 years, told her directly because she believed directness was a kindness. Thomas was dead. There had been an accident at the plant. Margaret sat in silence for several minutes, then asked if she could return to finish her class because the children would worry if she left suddenly. The principal said no, that was not necessary, and sent Margaret home with another teacher to stay with her. Samuel Washington's mother, Lucille, learned of her son's death when a foreman from the plant came to the boarding house where the family rented 2 rooms. Samuel's 12-year-old sister answered the door. The foreman asked for Mrs. Washington. Lucille came to the door, saw the foreman's face, and immediately understood. She thanked him for coming and closed the door. Her daughter later remembered that her mother did not cry until hours later, after she had told the other children and made arrangements with the church and begun the impossible task of figuring out how the family would survive without Samuel's income. Bethlehem Steel's response followed a pattern established over decades. There was an internal investigation, but it was conducted by company engineers and supervisors, not outside authorities. The findings, released 3 days later, attributed the accident to mechanical failure compounded by operator positioning error. The mechanical failure was acknowledged. The hydraulic line had ruptured due to fatigue, but the report also suggested that the workers had been positioned too close to the die, implying that proper procedure had not been followed. This was untrue. The men had been positioned exactly where the work required them to be, but the suggestion of worker error served a purpose. It complicated liability and provided justification for limiting compensation. The families received death benefits as required by Pennsylvania's workers' compensation law, enacted in 1915. The law prevented families from suing employers for workplace deaths, but required companies to pay set compensation amounts. For John Kowalski's family, $500 immediately and $6 per week for 300 weeks. For Thomas O'Brien's mother, who was his dependent, $500 and $5 per week for 300 weeks. For Samuel Washington's family, $500 and $5 per week for 300 weeks. These amounts were calculated based on formulas in the law and represented a fraction of what the men would have earned had they lived. Anna Kowalski did some arithmetic and realized that the total compensation over 6 years would be less than John had earned in 3 years of work. She also realized that company housing policy required families of deceased workers to vacate within 90 days unless the widow found other employment with the company. She applied for a position in the plant cafeteria and was hired at $2.50 per day. Margaret Sullivan never married. She taught school for 40 years and became an advocate for workplace safety regulations, speaking at union meetings and writing letters to state legislators. When Pennsylvania expanded its workers' compensation law in 1927, she testified before the state assembly about Thomas's death and the inadequacy of existing protections. She kept the invitations to their wedding in a drawer until she died in 1978. Lucille Washington moved her family to Philadelphia 6 months after Samuel's death, finding work as a domestic servant. Her daughter Elizabeth, Samuel's younger sister who had been 10 years old when he died, later became a nurse specializing in emergency care for industrial accident victims. In an oral history recorded in 1985, she said that she chose that specialty because of her brother, because she wanted to save people like him even though she knew she could never save him. The press in shop number 7 was repaired and back in operation within 11 days. The hydraulic line was replaced. Additional inspection procedures were implemented, consisting of visual checks during shift changes. The press continued operating until 1952, when it was finally retired, not because of safety concerns, but because newer technology made it obsolete. In those 29 years of operation after the accident, it was involved in 3 more serious incidents, none fatal, but all involving hydraulic system failures. The pattern was established and would continue. Defer maintenance, run equipment to failure, compensate families minimally, and restart production as quickly as possible. In the days following the accident, the investigation proceeded with a thoroughness typical of corporate inquiries designed to limit liability rather than uncover truth. Pennsylvania's state factory inspector arrived on August 20, 3 days after the deaths. His report, filed 2 weeks later, concluded that mechanical failure of hydraulic supply line due to metal fatigue was the primary cause, with worker positioning as a contributing factor. The phrasing was careful. By identifying mechanical failure as primary, the report acknowledged corporate responsibility. By mentioning worker positioning, it introduced ambiguity. Were the workers where they should have been? The report did not say they were not, but it did not say they were either. Internal Bethlehem Steel documents, discovered decades later during unrelated litigation, told a different story. Maintenance logs showed 14 separate work orders related to the hydraulic system between January and August 1923. The requests ranged from routine seal replacements to more concerning issues: unusual vibrations, slow ram descent, visible oil seepage from pipe joints. Every request was marked with the same notation: defer to next planned maintenance window. But no maintenance window was ever planned. The press could not be shut down for extended periods without impacting production schedules, and production schedules were sacrosanct. One document was particularly damning. A memo dated the 12th of July 1923 from the shop number 7 foreman to the plant superintendent recommended immediate inspection of hydraulic lines based on persistent operational anomalies and worker reports of unusual system behavior. The superintendent's response, handwritten in the margin, read, "Inspection will be scheduled during August shutdown for annual boiler inspection." But the boiler inspection scheduled for late August did not require shutting down the forging presses. It was a justification for delay, not a plan for action. By the time August arrived, 3 men were dead. No criminal charges were ever filed. This was typical for industrial accidents of the era. The workers' compensation system, which provided guaranteed benefits to families regardless of fault, explicitly prohibited those families from suing employers for negligence. The trade-off seemed reasonable in theory. Workers gained certainty of compensation without needing to prove fault, and employers gained protection from catastrophic lawsuit judgments. In practice, it meant that corporate decisions leading to preventable deaths carried no legal consequences beyond modest financial settlements. The financial impact on Bethlehem Steel was minimal. The immediate death benefits paid to the 3 families totaled $1,500. The ongoing weekly payments, extending over 6 years, would total approximately $8,000 more. The cost to repair the hydraulic system was roughly $3,000. Total, under $13,000 for 3 deaths. For context, Bethlehem Steel's net profit in 1923 was over $17 million. The accident represented 0.07% of annual profit. From a purely financial perspective, the deaths barely registered. The impact on the families was, of course, total. Anna Kowalski gave birth to her 5th child, a daughter, in January 1924. She worked in the plant cafeteria until 1943, when declining health forced her to stop. She never remarried. Her oldest son, John Jr., did become an engineer, graduating from Lehigh University in 1934 on scholarship. He worked for DuPont for 40 years and credited his father's death with giving him a healthy respect for industrial equipment and an unhealthy contempt for people who prioritize production over safety. The daughter, born after John Sr.'s death, never met her father but kept a photograph of him on her dresser until she died at 89 in 2013. In the immediate aftermath, did anything change? At Bethlehem Steel, minimally. The hydraulic system inspection protocols were updated to include pressure testing of supply lines every 6 months. This was an improvement but hardly revolutionary. The company did not add redundant hydraulic lines, install fail-safe mechanisms to catch falling rams, or implement any of the engineering solutions that would become standard decades later. The press continued operating with essentially the same design that had failed catastrophically, relying on inspection and maintenance to prevent recurrence. More broadly across the steel industry, the accident was noted but not transformative. Trade journals published brief accounts. Engineering societies included it in their annual safety reports. But there was no industry-wide response, no collective recognition that hydraulic press design needed fundamental rethinking. Each company maintained its own practices, and those practices prioritized production efficiency over worker safety. The 1920s were, in general, a terrible decade for industrial safety. The post-World War I economic boom drove production to unprecedented levels, and workplace fatalities increased correspondingly. In steel and iron industries alone, over 1,800 workers died in 1923. Forging accidents accounted for perhaps 100 of those deaths. The Bethlehem incident was tragic, but statistically unremarkable. It joined a list of similar events that year: a ladle failure at Carnegie that killed 4, a crane collapse at Republic Steel that killed 6, a blast furnace explosion at Youngstown Sheet and Tube that killed 11. Each incident generated brief attention, modest compensation payments, and minimal change. The first significant shift came not from corporate conscience but from worker organization. The 1930s brought the Great Depression, which paradoxically strengthened labor movements. When unemployment reached 25%, workers had less to lose by organizing and demanding better conditions. The Wagner Act of 1935 gave unions legal protection to organize and bargain collectively. The Steelworkers Organizing Committee, formed in 1936, made workplace safety a core bargaining issue alongside wages and hours. Union contracts began requiring third-party safety inspections, giving workers the right to refuse demonstrably unsafe work, and establishing safety committees with real authority to shut down equipment. These changes did not eliminate industrial accidents, but they shifted the balance of power. For the first time, workers could formally challenge management decisions that prioritized production over safety, and management faced consequences in the form of work stoppages and labor actions for ignoring safety concerns. The transformation accelerated after World War II. The war had demonstrated that industrial safety and productivity were not opposed but complementary. Plants with better safety records had higher output because they spent less time responding to accidents and training replacement workers. This lesson, combined with growing union strength and increased public awareness of workplace hazards, pushed the industry towards substantive changes. By the 1950s, hydraulic press design had evolved significantly. Redundant hydraulic systems became standard, with secondary lines capable of supporting the ram if primary lines failed. Load-holding valves, which trapped hydraulic fluid in the cylinder even if supply pressure dropped, prevented freefall scenarios. Mechanical locks were redesigned for quick engagement, allowing them to be used routinely rather than only during extended maintenance. Sensing systems that automatically stopped ram descent if pressure anomalies were detected became common. These were all engineering solutions that could have been implemented in 1918 when the Bethlehem press was built, but were not because the economic incentives did not exist. The most transformative change came in 1970 with the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which created OSHA and established federal authority over workplace safety. For the first time, there were national standards that applied across industries and states, inspectors with authority to shut down unsafe operations, and meaningful penalties for violations. OSHA standards for hydraulic presses, codified in the 1970s and refined over subsequent decades, mandated virtually every safety feature that modern presses incorporate: redundant systems, fail-safe mechanisms, emergency stops, barrier guards, and rigorous inspection protocols. The irony is that by the time these comprehensive safety measures became mandatory, the industrial landscape had already transformed. American steel production peaked in the 1970s and declined steadily thereafter. Bethlehem Steel, once the second largest steel producer in the country, filed for bankruptcy in 2001 and was liquidated in 2003. The plant where John Kowalski, Thomas O'Brien, and Samuel Washington died was demolished in 1998. Shop number 7, the specific building where the accident occurred, was torn down in 1982. The 300-ton press that killed them was sold for scrap. Today, modern forging operations bear little resemblance to their 1920s predecessors. Computer controls monitor every aspect of press operation, from hydraulic pressure to ram position to die temperature. Sensors can detect anomalies measured in milliseconds, and shut down operations before catastrophic failure occurs. Hydraulic systems use synthetic fluids that are far less prone to thermal degradation than the mineral oils used a century ago. Material science has advanced to the point where metal fatigue is well understood and predictable, allowing engineers to design components with accurate service life estimates and replacement schedules based on actual stress cycles rather than guesswork. Perhaps most importantly, the culture has changed. Modern industrial operations recognize that safety and productivity are inseparable. Workers are trained extensively, not just in operation, but in hazard recognition. Safety committees exist in every facility. Near-miss incidents are investigated as thoroughly as actual accidents, because the goal is prevention rather than response. Companies understand, partly through regulation but increasingly through genuine recognition, that preventing accidents is far cheaper than responding to them, both in direct costs and in less tangible impacts like workforce morale and public reputation. And yet, the fundamental physics has not changed. A hydraulic press still stores enormous energy. Metal still fatigues under cyclic loading. Systems still fail when maintenance is deferred. The difference is that we now design for failure, assuming that components will eventually reach their limits, and building redundancy so that when they do, the consequences are manageable rather than catastrophic. We inspect not just when something seems wrong, but on schedules designed to catch problems before they become critical. We listen to workers who notice anomalies because we have learned, slowly and at tremendous cost, that the people closest to the equipment often know things that do not show up in engineering calculations or inspection reports. But this knowledge came too late for John Kowalski, Thomas O'Brien, and Samuel Washington. They died in an era when stored energy was poorly understood, when maintenance was optional, when worker concerns were dismissed, and when the implicit calculation was that losing a few workers was an acceptable cost of doing business. The engineering knowledge to make their deaths preventable existed in 1923. The technology to implement safety systems existed. What did not exist was the will, the regulatory framework, or the economic incentive. There is a small memorial at the site of the former Bethlehem Steel plant, now a museum and casino complex. The memorial lists the names of workers who died at the facility between its founding in 1857 and its closure in 2003. There are over 600 names. 3 of them are John Kowalski, Thomas O'Brien, and Samuel Washington, with a single date next to their names, the 17th of August, 1923. Most visitors walk past without stopping. The names mean nothing to them, just a list of the long dead in a museum dedicated to industrial heritage. But those names meant everything to Anna Kowalski and her 5 children, to Margaret Sullivan, who taught school for 40 years and never married, to Lucille Washington and her children, who lost not just Samuel but the future he represented, to the co-workers who went back to work the next day beneath the same press, knowing it could happen again, knowing that they too were expendable. The 300-ton press that crushed those 3 men was doing exactly what it was designed to do, exerting irresistible force to shape steel. The failure was not in the machine itself, but in every decision that surrounded it. The decision to build a system with single-point failure modes, the decision to defer maintenance to maximize production, the decision to dismiss worker concerns as overreaction, the decision to prioritize quarterly profits over long-term safety investment, the decision, repeated at every level, from shop floor to boardroom, that some level of worker death was acceptable. Every safety regulation we have today was written in someone's blood. Every redundant system, every inspection protocol, every emergency shutdown mechanism exists because somewhere, at some time, its absence killed people. The hydraulic press safety standards that OSHA enforces were created because John Kowalski, Thomas O'Brien, and Samuel Washington died, and because hundreds of others died in similar incidents over decades, until finally the accumulated weight of death became too heavy to ignore. We cannot bring them back. We cannot undo the suffering their deaths caused. What we can do, what we must do, is remember why the protections we have today exist. Remember that they were not gifts from benevolent corporations or prescient regulators. They were won through loss, demanded by workers who had watched too many co-workers die, and implemented only when the cost of not implementing them became untenable. The press is gone now, melted down for scrap decades ago. The building where it operated is gone. The company that owned it is gone. But the lesson remains. When energy is stored, it must be respected. When systems are complex, they must be redundant. When workers identify hazards, they must be heard. When profit and safety conflict, safety must prevail, not because it is profitable, but because the alternative is measured in empty chairs, at dinner tables, in children who grow up without fathers, in promises that can never be kept. John Kowalski never met his youngest daughter. Thomas O'Brien never married Margaret Sullivan. Samuel Washington never saw his siblings finish school. They went to work on an ordinary morning in August 1923, and they did not come home because a pipe that should have been inspected was not inspected, because a concern that should have been addressed was not addressed, because in the calculation of 1920s industrial capitalism, their lives were worth less than a day of downtime on a production schedule. Remember them. Remember why the regulations exist. Remember that every protection we have today exists because someone, somewhere, paid for it with their life.